When you play the Game of Thrones,
Subscribe and like.
you die. There is no middle ground.
Welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be talking about the Winds of Winter sample chapters. Now, this is not going to be a summary or a ranking of them. It's going to be more looking at the sample chapters overall and what can that tell us about the Winds of Winter in terms of how many chapters it could possibly be. Why is George R.R. Martin stuck on the book? Why is it taken so long? Are some of these chapters outdated? Do they need to be rewritten? Is that why George is also struggling? Is because so many years now passed that George is now having to go back and rewriting some of these even sample chapters. So that's going to be the whole topic of this video. We'll briefly go through the sample chapters, look at the estimated page count of them, look at the rest of the series, and try to figure out a comparison for the book. Also, guys, I did want to throw this in here. While I was recording, I did forget to mention the Theon chapter as well. So there's actually 12 that we have, not 11. So when I mention that going forward, just keep that in mind that yes, there is a Theon chapter as well. So the Winds of Winter sample chapters has basically 11 that we do know of. Now they are to varying degrees. We're really going to talk about 8 of them because 2 of them are basically summaries. It's not the actual chapter, so we can't base anything off of page length or anything like that. But we can look at the contents of them and go, okay, well, this is what is happening. That can give us an indication of how many chapters will be in this certain plot line. And then the Asha one, which is the other one that's kind of like, it's included on as a sample chapter because we have like a little tiny sneak peek of what it could be. And it's very interesting that as I'm recording of this, we have this controversy about AI being used to try and fill out like the couple paragraphs or maybe just a paragraph that we do have of the Asha Winds of Winter sample chapter. But again, it's not anything that we can base a whole chapter on. How many pages is it going to be? Anything like that. So we really have about 8 full Winds of Winter sample chapters. We have Arianne 1 and 2, Sansa 1, Barristan 1, Victarion 1, Tyrion 2, Aeron 1, The Forsaken. Those are the actual like completed chapters. Now within those chapters, some of them are much older than others. The Mercy chapter has basically been done by George, upwards of like 20 years ago. So I think that chapter will be rewritten by George if it hasn't already, just based upon the fact that when George was originally planning out the Arya storyline, it was supposed to go much differently. There was supposed to be a time skip. That didn't happen. So the Arya chapter now, as much as, I like the idea of it, it doesn't fit narratively when you read Dance and then go to read that sample chapter right after. It just doesn't really fit with the Arya character. So my biggest problem is, even out of all of these sample chapters, there's only really like 7 that are actually complete that I think for the most part will probably stay relatively the same. But what do these chapters tell us about the Winds of Winter and its structure? So one thing I've criticized both Feast and Dance on, I would say more especially Dance, is that Dance has a lot of fluff in it. It has a lot of chapters that don't necessarily feel the most, necessary. We have a lot of travel chapters. Tyrion's whole journey in Dance is about traveling. You have Quentyn, who's traveling for basically the whole first half of Dance. You have a lot of that going on. Brienne, for instance, is all about traveling. Now, with her traveling, there's a little bit more of like adventure to it, so it's a little bit more acceptable. But for instance, the type of stuff we've been seeing in the last 2 books is something you would have never seen in the first 3, in terms of having an entire storyline dedicated to just traveling. So for instance, the one I always reference is, in book 1, Catelyn goes from Winterfell to King's Landing. We don't see any of it. It happens completely off the page. And that makes sense. We don't need to be in Catelyn's head while she's taking this boat journey or she's traveling across the north to get to White Harbor to then go to King's Landing. That's the type of stuff that does not happen now anymore in George's work. So what do I want to point to right away? Arianne 1 and Arianne 2 are distinctively travel chapters. Do I like her travel chapters? Yes, that has a lot to do with I like her POV. I think what George puts into her head and the situation she's being placed in are very fascinating and interesting. But the problem is, if you don't love Arianne as much as I do, so for instance, me and JC talked about our rankings and I had Arianne usually higher than JC, a lot of it was just based upon the fact that it's like, we're just traveling, we're trying to get to Storm's End, and so when you think about that, you think about the pacing of the Winds of Winter, if we're going to have only 2 books left in the series, you would think, George has to speed those things up. but he doesn't seem to be doing that. And I think that's one issue that George is having, is because of the way his writing has changed. We spend more time on world building. We spend more time on traveling. There isn't as much, skipping. Not exactly skipping, but I mean letting other characters have POVs while our characters travel. That's just not a thing for George anymore. He hasn't done that for really the last 2 books. And so Arianne is a clear example that that trend is going to continue unless George, as he's been writing Winds of Winter and he's gotten further, has realized he can't do that. And maybe he starts combining chapters and stuff like that. But then the other thing I also want to look at is just the amount of fluff that books like Dance have. Times when it feels like chapters can be condensed, where they can be combined. I think Barristan 1 and 2 are kind of the same vein. Barristan 1 is basically we're rallying to start the battle, but the battle doesn't even start. So Barristan is giving a speech. We're having like a preparation to the Battle of Fire. It's kind of similar to, say, Sansa's chapter in A Clash of Kings before we get to the Battle of the Blackwater, where it's a lot of building up the tension and establishing, the battle more or less. The same is here with Barristan, but when you think about how much buildup we've had to the Battle of Fire, given how many chapters Barristan has at the end of the 5th book, and then here where it's like we have Barristan who has a chapter, we then have Barristan 2, which is a summary of him in the battle. We have 2 other Tyrion chapters happening around building into the battle, and then also in the middle of the battle, and then we also have a Victarion chapter leading into the battle as he's sailing to Meereen and Slaver's Bay. So when you think about all that, the amount of fluff there is kind of crazy. When you think about the Battle of the Blackwater, for instance, Sansa has 1 chapter where she goes to see Joffrey and Tyrion off. She goes to Cersei. We then get a chapter of Davos on the Battle of the Blackwater, the major chapter in which the wildfire trap goes off. You have Tyrion responding to that in a very short chapter. We then go back to Sansa, kind of reacting to some of that. We go back to Tyrion and get the final part of the battle, and then Sansa telling us what happened afterwards. So there's about, 6 chapters I just said for the entirety of the Battle of the Blackwater. I've already told you for the Winds of Winter, we almost have 5 to 6 chapters of just build up and not even getting to a payoff yet. So what we've talked about, especially with me and the Advocate when we've talked about the Winds of Winter, is really the idea that George R.R. Martin has not become as efficient as he used to be. Things that didn't need to take as many chapters are taking a lot longer. Now, the Battle of Fire is very complex because you have a number of factions at the same time. Like you have the Slayer faction, but also Tyrion getting the Second Sons to betray them. You also have Victarion with Dragonminer. How's that going to play into it? Then you also have Barristan leading the Free Forces. So it's a tough deal, and we're not inside George's mind, so we don't know how he wants to finish that battle or the events that are going to happen. But the thing I'm trying to tell you is there is a lot of chapters that are going to be dedicated to the Battle of Fire, and we haven't even talked about Daenerys. We don't have a Daenerys Winds of Winter sample chapter, not even foreshadowing to it, nothing. So what does that tell you, right? We've already spent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 of the 11 Winds of Winter sample chapters are spent on Meereen. That's not even, including Daenerys. And I know she's not Meereen, but that's like her plotline more or less. That tells you right away that there's going to be a lot of chapters that we're trying to get through something, but it takes a long time to do so. Let's get away from Meereen. Sansa 1, I think, is one of the clear examples of, even though this isn't one of my favorite chapters of the Winds of Winter sample chapters, it's a more efficient chapter because Sansa is, one, growing as a character. We're seeing her progress her plotline and building up some of the world building of the Vale. So the Sansa chapter, to me, is one of the most efficient chapters in terms of building the plot, building character, building world building, and progressing. We only have one Sansa, the Winds of Winter sample chapter, but it's very important. We get more of Sansa developing and being able to manipulate men, manipulating Harry the Heir, and that relationship that's starting to form. Very efficient chapter, and we continue on. So again, Sansa is chapters we need more of. Efficient chapters that aren't bogged down in building up certain things, or is too focused on traveling or world building. If George wants to finish the books in the next 2, he needs more chapters like Sansa's first chapter in the Winds of Winter. The Arya Mercy chapter I don't really want to talk about too much because it's just a chapter that needs to be rewritten. But I think it's kind of similar in the same vein of Sansa's chapter, where it does a good job of being efficient in terms of getting through a plot line for Arya, showing her growth, and just continuing on her story. And I think it's interesting because Sansa and Arya are very much minor characters in the last 2 books, and for the most part, those are very efficient characters. Those are characters that we don't see a lot of them, but when we do, it's forwarding the plot. It is very efficient of George. George's efficiency for those characters that don't have a lot of chapters is usually actually pretty good. The Forsaken, there's not much to talk about. It's one of the best chapters, probably in A Song of Ice and Fire as a whole, so there's not a whole lot to talk about. So moving then to the North chapters, and a lot of people would probably be mistaken in the idea that when we open the Winds of Winter, we're going to just dive straight into really the Battle of Ice. That's kind of where Dance with Dragons seemed to have been leading. It seemed like we were a chapter or 2 away from the battle. That doesn't seem to be the case, because in both Asha's chapter and Theon's chapter, we're still building up to the battle. And even at the end of Theon's Winds of Winter sample chapter, it seems like Theon is going to have some sort of trial, more or less, to determine his fate. So again, the problem I have is not that I don't love Theon's chapter and that I don't love the Northern plotline. It's we're still a couple of chapters away from the Battle of Ice. And when you start to put all this together, so we've talked about 12 chapters in the Winds of Winter, let's start to think about the series as a whole. So the chapter count for each book is a Game of Thrones at 73, a Clash of Kings at 70, a Storm of Swords at 82, a Dance of Dragons at 73. I very much lean towards the Winds of Winter will be more like a Storm of Swords or Dance of Dragons, where it'll have more chapters and it'll be a longer book. So let's just take it as it's going to be like a Storm of Swords with 82 chapters plus. 12 chapters is a significant portion of your book already. And the fact that we haven't even really gotten into the Battle of Fire all that much, we're not into the Battle of Ice yet, we haven't gotten to Storm's End yet, Arianne and Young Griff have not met yet, it tells you there's a clear issue with trying to fit everything in. Because again, we just talked about 12 chapters, right? We didn't talk about multiple plot lines. We didn't talk about Cersei's plot line. We didn't talk about the Wall plot line. We didn't talk about Daenerys' plot line. So we have 12 chapters that aren't even including all the different plot lines. So for instance, like Feast for Crows, you kind of know all the plot lines within the first 10 chapters, right? You have all your kind of established POVs more or less. It's not as simple as that, but I mean, in terms of the main ones, that's not the case here. So if you then include, okay, we're going to assume we're going to get one Daenerys POV at the beginning, we're going to get one Mel POV at the beginning, a Cersei point of view in there. Again, we also aren't including Brienne or Jaime. You're looking at almost 15 to 16 point of view chapters, and we're not really even into the main moments that have been left over from Dance. And so that kind of gives you all you need to know. The idea that George, his efficiency, may be causing a problem. And I want to take an even a further step than this, because we're already looking at it, and by the time we get into the Battle of Ice, the Battle of Fire, we're probably going to be a quarter of the way through the book by the time those events finish up or wrap up. That's just the conclusion of Dance with Dragons. That's not even the story of the Winds of Winter yet. That tells you a lot about why George is struggling. But let's then go to the idea of what I've found for the average manuscript pages a chapter. This is hard to do just based upon the fact that the Winds of Winter sample chapters are not like a physical in a book, so we can't tell how many pages they're going to be. We can make estimates, and so the estimates I found is it looks like we're looking at probably an average of 18 to 21 manuscript pages a chapter, which makes a lot of sense given the fact what A Feast for Crows and Dance did. They started giving us longer chapters. George started going away from the formula of the first 3 books. The first 3 books largely have shorter chapters that get to the point. And as we got into Feast, I mean, Feast is not a long book in terms of A Song of Ice and Fire, but in terms of a normal book, A Feast for Crows is pretty long, and it has less than 50 chapters. Those chapters are monstrously long. Multiple chapters in that book have well over 20 pages. The Winds of Winter could be very similar. It's been estimated that about 4 of these chapters are going to probably have at least 20 pages. So when you start putting all those things together and you start thinking about the average page count, and you start looking at books like A Storm of Swords, Clash of Kings, Game of Thrones, where that's not the case at all, it starts bringing into the idea of how does George, who already is struggling with how many chapters he has already given us and told us, and we know have to be there, and most of them are extremely long. You just get to the point where your book's going to be monstrously long in terms of page count and also in terms of chapter count. How are you going to fit all that in? And that's what so many people have talked about. And that was really the crux of everything I wanted to talk about in this video. It's just the idea of the Winds of Winter sample chapters are a lot more revealing than I think a lot of us give them in this community, because of how long they are, because of how inefficient some of them can be, certain plot lines that foreshadow that George is still kind of, I think, using some of the bad habits that he did in Dance and also in A Feast for Crows. And I don't want this to come off as me bashing those two books, but it is just looking at the blatant flaws of those books. And, I would say all the books have their certain flaws, and I'm pointing out those two because they're the most prevalent I'm seeing in the Winds of Winter within the first few chapters George has given us. So let me know what you guys think about the Winds of Winter. I know a lot of people don't think we're going to get it. I think that as the years have gone by in the community, and especially as a creator, I think my faith in a completed The Winds of Winter has pretty much deteriorated almost completely. I think we'll get whatever George has left. I just think eventually that's going to come out, and I think we'll see what George has, and largely we'll get a good portion of The Winds of Winter. He's made claims that he's 66% of the way done to 75% of the way done, so we'll get at least 2/3 maybe of that story, and we'll just have to see. But let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.